It is now my pleasure to introduce our opening keynote speaker. Shane Phillips is a UCLA researcher and author of The Affordable City. He manages the Randall Lewis Housing Initiative at the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies and co-hosts the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, translating emerging research for a non-academic audience of policymakers, practitioners, and advocates. I've heard more than one of you say that you have never been as excited about a speaker at a conference as you are about Shane Phillips. No pressure, Shane. As we all face the sometimes seemingly insurmountable task of turning the tide on housing affordability, Shane offers a framework and perspective on what it takes to turn policy ideas into practice. His remarks are sure to spark ideas, raise questions, and give us more tools to use as we navigate the complex policy dynamics that are so critical to housing affordability. Shane.
Test.
Oh, I see. Oh, no. This is fine. This one will be fine, yeah. Thank you, though. Well, it is good to be back in Montana. This is my second time here, but last time I was, I think, 12 or 14 years old. We spent a week on a ranch with an old friend of my parents. I think the two most memorable moments for me were going to a bar for the first time. It's generally not allowed for children in other states. They didn't let me drink, but I do remember some very explicit photos in the bathroom stalls. And then the other was spending some time in Glacier National Park, which was, not surprisingly beautiful, and making my parents very angry for wandering off with no water on a very hot day amid a bear warning. But I survived. And so for just a little more background about me, let's see, we got 1248, okay. So my name's Shane Phillips. I grew up in Washington State, mostly in various suburbs within an hour or two of Seattle. I have a pretty unusual background, having dropped out of high school, worked as a cable installer at Comcast, and a package loader and sorter at UPS, returned to school, got a degree in biochemistry. Working as a tuberculosis researcher at the University of Washington, I realized that what I'd really become passionate about over the years was not medicine, but urban planning. And yada, 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 15 years later, here I am, standing in front of you talking about housing affordability. So nowadays, I'm at UCLA, and I manage the Randall Lewis Housing Initiative at the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, where we study the effects of different policies on affordability, displacement, access to opportunity, health, you name it. I am certainly a researcher at heart, and I can and do often spend many hours absorbed by a giant data set. But what I'm really passionate about is turning the knowledge that's generated at schools like UCLA into real-world policy. And I think more importantly, into real-world improvements in people's lives. That is what I'm here for. I will get into the weeds at times during this presentation, and that might give the impression that I am more interested in data and studies than the people that they represent, but you would be mistaken. I am here because I want all of your communities, all of our communities to succeed, to be places that adapt to an evolving future, for sure, but that you're still proud and excited to call home. What I am not here to do is make any decisions for you. My role is just to contribute to a conversation, help you think about your options, present what I know about the likely consequences of taking one path or another, and hopefully give you some tools to help you make those local conversations you're going to have more constructive and productive. This way. So before we dig in here, I did want to share a little bit about the podcast, but it was already mentioned, so I'm just going to skip ahead here and save a little time because we're behind anyway, and just say if you're interested in listening, we just produced an 8-part series on homelessness that I'm quite proud of, and I think it's a good entree to the podcast itself. So If anything I say sounds interesting and you want to dig in further, we have over 70 episodes and well over 70 hours of content there to waste a few days of time. So anyway, on to the book. Oh, The Affordable City is a sort of handbook of policies that can help cities stay affordable. That's what it's intended as. And while researching and writing the book, I started thinking about what connects these dozens of policies that I was writing about and came up with the themes of supply, stability, and subsidy. And the book is as much an argument for why cities and states should pursue all three as it is a guide for how to do so. Supply, stability, and subsidy is also a great way for me to make everyone angry at me for at least one reason. Those three S's are going to be the focus of this talk here. Before we get there, I think I probably need to explain myself a little bit. I imagine that some of you are wondering why you have someone from California, and not just California, but Los Angeles of all places, here talking to you about housing affordability and how to make housing affordable. I might also give you some advice on how to reduce your traffic congestion or keep your taxes low. But seriously, it is completely fair to have a bit of skepticism about what you could learn from or about housing affordability from someone from LA. My short answer is that as someone who has experienced LA up close for over a decade, I'm really here to tell you not to be like us. Please do not be like us. Learn from the mistakes that we have made and do all that you can not to repeat them. My longer, more substantive answer, though, is that even though LA's problems can seem very distant, they are much closer than you think. Maybe that's becoming apparent in these last few years. On the one hand, yes, housing in LA is far more expensive. The median home is approaching $1 million. At current interest rates, you'd have to earn more than $200,000 a year for that median home to be considered affordable, and you would need to somehow come up with a nearly $200,000 down payment on top of your $7,000 a month mortgage. Home prices in LA are at least double those in most of Montana's markets, if not triple or more. And in that sense, we are very different places. Also, our city alone has 4 million people, but let's just stick to housing. On the other hand, when I study and visit communities across the country, I see almost everyone doing exactly what got Los Angeles and the whole state of California where they are today. I see plans and zoning codes written in the 50s and 60s and 70s that have barely been updated to reflect lessons from the past 50 plus years or the ways that society and technology has changed it. I see communities betting their futures and the futures of their children on the hope that if they don't plan for more residents, then those residents won't come. I see the same indecision and delay and inaction, and I see the fruits of a growing economy being captured by our homes rather than ourselves and our neighbors. Los Angeles is reaping what it sowed from those years of inaction. Homes that cost more than double what a middle-class family can afford, more overcrowded households than anywhere else in the nation, and among the longest and most unpleasant commutes. We struggle to hold on to businesses whose customer base isn't in Los Angeles itself, and a huge share of our budget goes towards solving housing problems that we created for ourselves. Somewhere around $1 billion in a city with a budget of $12 billion, almost 10% of our budget. Worst, we have utterly failed the 50,000 people who have no home to sleep in on any given night, about 1 in every 80 residents, and about 4 of whom die on our streets every day on average. This failure also affects the quality of life for the city's other 3.9 million residents, with everything from parks to transit to healthcare facilities disproportionately strained by the unhoused population, really through no fault of their own. This was all done in the name of protecting our unique neighborhood character, which everyone has. The things that made Los Angeles special and that residents most appreciated about living there. The ironic and really sad truth is that we could not have destroyed those things more effectively if we had tried. We made the mistake of believing that we could build a great place and then freeze it in time, and that no one else would ever want to be a part of the wonderful thing that we had built. We believed, as many people still seem to believe, that the built environment was more critical to the character of our neighborhoods than the neighbors themselves. What I want to emphasize is that from a housing policy perspective, California is not so different from Missoula or Butte or Bozeman or Billings or your neighbors in Idaho or the Dakotas or Wyoming or most of the US. What really distinguishes you from us, and again, this is only from a housing perspective because I understand what a grievous insult it might be to be compared to California in other ways. What really distinguishes you from us is that the demand for housing hit LA much earlier and harder. But we're on a similar trajectory, and you're really, only a decade or two behind. That is the bad news, but in some way it's also the good news. It means that you can change course before you end up with LA-sized problems. The reality is that the longer you wait, the worse things will get, and the harder it will be to solve the problems that crop up. But the sooner you act, the more options you're going to have. I want to just share a few stats, because it's always helpful for me to just ground myself. Some of these stats were already mentioned. Population between 2012 and 2022 grew by 12%. Housing units up 9%. Most of the housing units in the state are single unit. About 31% of households rent. As in all places, the median income for renters is much lower than for homeowners, usually around half or a little bit more. But moving on to costs and affordability, in 2022, again, the median home value was $366,000, which is up 55% from the decade before, and that's adjusting for inflation. The more recent Zillow estimate is about $463,000 statewide, and of course there are places in the state where that's going to be much higher. Median rent is not up nearly as much, but this again is adjusted for inflation, so rents are getting less affordable. And I want to really focus on vacancy rate here because there's been a lot of change. Your vacancy rate in 2022 is 12.3%, and that's down from 16%. But the majority of these vacancies are and were in seasonal, vacation home, recreational type housing. And those are really not on the market. They're not creating space that's going to, keep prices from rising. Once we actually look at the market vacancy rate, the units that are for rent, for sale, rented but not yet occupied, sold but not yet occupied, that falls to 2.2%, which is incredibly low. And it's down from an already low 3.9% a decade earlier. When we look at rentals and owner-occupied housing individually, we see similar trends. That's really important just because we know from many years of research in every market that when vacancy rates fall, the pace at which rents and home prices increase gets higher, it grows faster. And when vacancy rates rise, rent growth slows. So I just wanted to set that context a little bit. My book, The Affordable City, has over 50 policy recommendations, but my focus in presentations like these is always on big picture priorities. I do this because policies are frankly easy to come by, and in scholarly and professional circles, there's usually pretty broad agreement about the kinds of policies that can improve housing affordability. The challenge is not really coming up with a list of effective policies, it's implementing them in a world where every change comes with trade-offs, has winners and losers, and where changing course is always harder than maintaining the status quo, even when we know that the status quo is flawed and full of problems. The challenge is convincing people that they will be better off in some alternate future. My framework for thinking about these housing priorities and for balancing these various trade-offs is what I call the 3 S's of supply, stability, and subsidy. So I'll go into these just a little bit, starting with supply. So supply is about making sure that we have enough housing to meet current and future needs, not just to accommodate population growth, but also to improve the housing stock, to respond to demographic shifts like an aging population and shrinking household sizes, as well as long-term economic shifts like an increasing amount of remote and hybrid work and goals like preserving open space or agricultural land, increasing access to opportunity, attracting and retaining jobs and businesses, and so on. Supply is the first of the three S's because the mismatch between housing supply and housing demand is the root cause of high and rising prices in most US cities. There is no such thing as a place where housing is both scarce and affordable. Fundamentally, prioritizing housing supply is about acknowledging that we live in a world of physical and economic constraints. There is the physical constraint that a growing, changing, aging population, an increasingly wealthy population requires a growing and changing stock of homes. We just need the space. The United States does have a serious inequality problem compared to many other countries, and that inequality does extend to housing, but you can't redistribute your way out of a shortage. If you want to reduce scarcity, then you need to build things. Then there's the economic reality that when housing is scarce, homeowners and landlords gain market power, and that power comes at the expense of home buyers and renters, and of future generations generally. We have many decades of evidence showing that when cities build more housing, they are better able to keep rents and home prices in check. That's true whether the new homes are market rate or subsidized, though both help and both have different strengths and benefits and costs. And we see that effect zooming all the way out to the metro area level and zooming all the way in to the block level, the neighborhood level. I'll come back to some of that research later on. The immediate goal of supply policies is housing abundance, essentially. And abundance is not just about the number of homes, but how suitable they are to a community's various and changing needs, from single adults to large families, and from birth to early career to retirement. Policies to support the supply can be reforms to zoning and building codes, review and approval processes, development standards like parking and setbacks, all of which determine what can be built and thus what it costs to build, and thus who cannot and can afford it. Supply policies can also help preserve or restore the existing stock, like, for example, protecting against oversaturation by short-term rentals, making sure we get the most of the housing stock we already have. Next up is stability. Stability is largely about making sure, as much as possible, that when changes come to a community, they don't come at the expense of those with the least to lose. Stability is not about freezing things in amber or shielding people from any and all consequences, but providing some measure of security and predictability for everyone who does their part and follows the rules. But to put this more philosophically, in contrast to supply, if supply is about acknowledging economic and physical constraints in the housing market, then stability for me is about acknowledging the moral obligations that we have to our fellow citizens and neighbors. Stabilizing policies can include anything from rent stabilization to eviction protections, rules ensuring people who receive housing assistance are actually able to find landlords who will accept it. Skeptics are quick to point out that these policies have hidden costs, and they are right. The same is true of supply and subsidy policies. The details always matter. I could point you to many cities that have imposed rent control to disastrous effect. But I could also point you to many places where similar policies have been quite successful. But even beyond that, if we're envisioning our future in Montana or anywhere else, I think most of us can agree it should be one where someone's rent can't be hiked 30% from one year to the next, where they can't be evicted for no reason, and with barely any warning, and where they're not treated as second-class citizens in our political system. In the past, I think the attitude toward housing stability was that if you wanted security and predictability, buy a home. That has always been a flawed idea, given the unequal access to homeownership that many Americans have had in the past and still have today. But as far as arguments go, it was a lot more defensible, say 50 years ago, when you could buy a home for 1 or 2 times the typical annual salary of a single breadwinner. Now there are very few places in the country where you can buy a home for less than 4 or 5 times the median income for a 2-earner household. And in many cities, the ratio is 6, 7, 8 to 1 or more. In LA, it's 12 to 1. That is the highest in the country, by the way. And as many examples as there are of destructive and counterproductive stabilizing policies, there are many more examples of them working perfectly well. They don't need to be so strong that they sacrifice all of a landlord's rights and privileges in favor of a tenant's, or so thoroughly erode the profitability or increase the risk of building housing and operating housing that supply ends up drying up. All we really need is a better balance. And the right balance will be different in California than it is in Montana, and it will probably be different among the cities in Montana as well. Moving on to the third S, subsidies. In many parts of the economy, well-designed markets can serve many people, most people, more efficiently and effectively than government, and I very strongly believe that applies to housing as well. Markets have incredible power and potential. But no matter how well designed the market, no matter how much housing it produces, some people will still be unable to afford any of the housing on the market, at least at some point in their lives. When all their other options have failed them, without subsidies, they will become homeless. And even though stability policies are important and valuable, they're really about protecting people from worsening circumstances like rising rents or eviction, and they don't have that much power to proactively improve people's lives. Supply and stability policies leave gaps, and subsidies can fill many of them. Subsidies are often used for supporting the construction of housing affordable to middle and lower income families, on long-term rent assistance programs, and on things like transitional housing, and they're necessary for the operation of things like homeless shelters. Funding for many of these programs, as you know, mostly comes from the federal government. Locally, development of affordable housing options can be supported by things like property tax abatements or fee reductions, which have short-term costs, but can pay themselves back in the long run and often with dividends. The reality is that as a nation, we already spend a ton of money on housing subsidies, well over $100 billion a year. It's just that somewhere around 80% of it goes to homeowners. And most of that 80% goes to the wealthiest homeowners, the ones with incomes over $150,000 or $200,000 per year, in the form of mortgage interest, property tax, and capital gains tax exemptions. We are not going to go down that road right now, but just want to signpost that. Without spending some level of public resources on housing, and specifically housing assistance for people who don't make $200,000 per year, many will be left behind as our economies and our communities change. Without subsidies, people who could have quickly gotten back on their feet with a little support can instead end up falling into worse and worse circumstances and requiring much more intensive and long-term and costly assistance down the road. We've seen with homelessness, for example, that we can reduce the long-term costs to the public by providing assistance early, and that it's often more costly to leave a person living on the street, using emergency health services and interacting with law enforcement more frequently, than to simply provide the financial assistance needed to help them afford housing. And that's to say nothing of the moral problem of allowing people to fall apart on the streets. To take a step back here, there is a very simple message underlying the three S's, and it is that different people and different communities have different needs, and people's needs change over time as well. It is impossible to meet all of those varying needs with just one tool, or prioritizing only supply or only stability or only subsidy. A new market rate apartment building does help keep rents from rising as quickly across the housing market, but it does not do anything for someone who's facing an imminent eviction. Supportive housing is a critical part of the solution to homelessness, but it doesn't do anything to keep homeownership within reach of a middle-class family. Each of the three S's has the power to shore up the weaknesses and cover some of the blind spots of the others. To me, the changes in the housing market that we saw following the outbreak of COVID-19 are maybe the best possible example of why supply is not a complete substitute for stability or subsidy. It showed us how much more agile demand is compared to supply. Many people were suddenly able to work from home, and demand for more suburban locations and larger homes went through the roof, at least for a time. And in response, rents in many cities went up 20 or 30% in a single year. Supply helps stabilize rents and housing prices, but it takes years to plan and build housing, even in the best circumstances, and people often cannot wait that long for relief to arrive. Without policies like rent stabilization, for example, or a healthy amount of subsidies, or both, we can really offer no credible response to the family whose rent increased from $1,200 to $1,500 in a single year, and who can't move elsewhere without losing access to gainful employment and a family network that saves them many thousands of dollars on childcare each year, and can't buy a home anytime soon when the median home costs 5 or 6 times the median household income, as it does in Missoula. Just last Friday, I was in Hendersonville, North Carolina, and a council member there told a group of us about a woman he knew, a 78-year-old widow who was being evicted, like at that very moment. The owner was getting older, the landlord, and his son took over the property management. This is a very common story. And he wanted to renovate the property and told her she needed to leave. No kind of allowances or anything, no sympathy whatsoever. She lives on something like $2,000 a month and had nowhere else to go, but the son just wouldn't budge on this. The woman is lucky to have this council member and other neighbors looking for solutions, but not everyone is so fortunate. And right now, even with all that support, the best solutions they have involve waiting lists of 6 months or more when she's facing an eviction in a month or two. I think we should ask ourselves what kinds of policies we would support if it meant preventing our own grandmother from becoming homeless, and then ask if there's a difference between what we support and what we would support in that case. Ask why we can't extend that same empathy and accommodation to others. That said, for all that stabilizing policies can give people breathing room and help them navigate through crises, they mostly don't address the underlying causes of housing affordability and instability. Cities like San Francisco and New York and yes, Los Angeles are poster children for what happens when you use stability and subsidy policies as a substitute for an adequate supply of housing rather than as a complement to it. Beyond the effects of these different policy priorities, this all matters from a coalition building perspective as well. Every community is going to have a wide array of groups and interests to represent, and none of us is going to get anything done without making common cause with a lot of others. And that's going to start with understanding other people's priorities and values. Evaluating our future plans through the lenses of supply, stability, and subsidy, or something similar, is one way of making sure that we're considering those different interests and pushing us to identify solutions that take those interests into account so we can all go forward together. Something I've learned over the past few years is that when people read or hear about the 3 S's, they can be tempted to take a sort of partial approach to it. They'll like the argument in favor of supply policies but not stability, or vice versa. And so they'll pick 1 or 2 priorities, kind of learn from them a bit, then just toss out the rest. I would really prefer that you think of supply, stability, and subsidy as a 3-legged stool for affordable cities and communities, something that's sturdy and resilient when all the legs are in place, but if any one is removed, it really topples right over. Supply without stability can create unnecessary harm. It does add housing, and that's important, but it can do so without any regard for the locations or kinds of development that are most likely to have negative consequences, like displacement in communities where you already have many renters, and many lower income renters in particular. Supply without any accompanying subsidies, again, leaves many struggling households completely behind. Stability without supply or without subsidy does not really improve conditions. It just manages decline. Stability policies can treat, delay, and mitigate the symptoms of a dysfunctional housing market, and that is important and it's necessary, just as we need shelters as well as supportive housing, but they rarely address the underlying causes on their own. Subsidy without stability can result in many people needing assistance who wouldn't have otherwise. And finally, subsidy without supply is a recipe for endlessly increasing costs. This is in some ways the story of Los Angeles, and it's why 6 or 7 years after spending a few $1 billion on housing and services for homeless residents, we now have even more homeless residents, and the cost of building a 400 square foot supportive housing unit has gone from an already high $350,000 to now over $600,000 per unit. To be clear, we would be worse without having spent that money, but we failed to address the underlying problem of constantly rising rents, and although we're helping more people out of homelessness than we ever have before in our history, the number of people becoming homeless each year is increasing even more quickly. Supply, stability, and subsidy just work better together than apart. As I mentioned earlier, supply is really the thing that you have the most control over locally. Land use policy has historically been handled by local jurisdictions for better and for worse. So I want to spend a bit more time on this. First, I just want to make sure we're on the same page about what the supply picture has looked like. I think this is probably unnecessary, but you never know. The first chart here shows per capita housing production since about 1960. Even with the regular ups and downs of the economic cycle, you can see a very, very clear downward trend. Housing is growing scarcer, and the very predictable and predicted result is that it's growing both older and much less affordable. This image shows per capita housing production in major metro areas across the country for 2 time periods, 1990 to 2007 in orange and 2008 to 2018 in green. What it shows is that every one of these metro areas built less housing per capita than it did in the decade following the global financial crisis. I think I said that wrong, but I think you get my point. They built less after. Cities with some of the highest demand, like LA and New York City, built barely anything during this period. They're at the bottom in both time periods. And that is a big part of why so many Californians are moving to Montana these days. Also, it's a lovely place. If we look at how much Montana's been building, it's got a lot more in common with California than with higher production states like Nevada, South Dakota, and Idaho. I don't think I need to say much more than that. Now, as a researcher, I genuinely do my best to accommodate different interpretations of research. It is complicated at the best of times, and how you design a study really can skew the results that you come away with. But within the world of housing research, there is almost nothing I can say with more confidence than that if you have 2 cities with similar demand, the one that builds more housing will end up a lot more affordable over the long and medium term. There is a very common belief that building homes attracts rich people, and those rich people moving in is what drives up the price of nearby housing. I hear this all the time. I'm sure many people here hear this all the time. I'm sure some here believe that to be true. And I absolutely understand why people jump to that conclusion. But just because it's understandable does not mean it's correct, and there's quite a lot of evidence that it's not. The reality is that all over the country, many if not most of the people who move into new housing are from the same metro area where that housing was built. And I will talk more about that in just a second, but even if that were not the case, it still wouldn't be a reason not to build housing because rich people can afford to move to your city whether you build new homes or not. I grew up in Washington State, as I mentioned, and if you've moved from one part of the country to another, I think you'll understand this intuitively. If you've been on like Zillow or apartments.com, you can look for units in specific cities or counties, and you can choose the age range of the housing that you're interested in, new, old, medium. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that no one who's looking for housing goes on these sites searching only for new multifamily housing without any geographic preference. Like, I don't care if it's Portland or St. Louis or Buffalo or Missoula, just as long as it's a rental that was built in the last 3 years. No one does that. What most of us do, what I did, and what all of us should have the freedom to do, is we get a job or a college acceptance offer, or our family grows or shrinks or wants to be closer together or wants to be further apart, or we just decide that we want to live in a specific new city that interests us. Then we look for housing in that place. Most of us do not limit our search to newly built housing, and many don't even prefer it. And even those who do will usually settle for older housing if new homes are not available. That's why refusing to build new homes just exacerbates the problem. It doesn't change the fact that these people want to live in your city. The demand is there. What it does is force them to compete for the older housing stock when they arrive, driving up its price and squeezing out lower and middle income households. When we build housing, it has the effect of pulling people out of older, more affordable units into newer and better stock, creating vacancies in those older units that help stabilize rents and prices. When we don't build, that upward pull turns into a downward push. As demand grows, people with more resources crowd out those with less, pushing them into lower quality housing. Upper income households push middle income households into lower income neighborhoods, and the people already in those lower income neighborhoods are pushed into overcrowded conditions, into other cities and towns, out of state, or onto the street. We see this empirically in both the US and abroad, in something that has really just recently been coined called migration chains or moving chains. As I said, when a new building opens up, data shows that the majority of people moving into those new units already lived in the metro area where the building is located. That means they're leaving behind a unit somewhere nearby, and that unit is almost always more affordable than the one that they're moving into. The same applies to whoever moves into that newly vacated unit. They're usually leaving behind something more affordable too. To put some illustrative numbers to this, imagine a new market rate apartment building opens up and the units rent for $2,000 a month. That's expensive, but household A can afford it. So they move in and they leave behind an apartment renting for $1,600 a month, let's say. After the landlord touches up that vacated unit and puts it back on the market, household B moves into it, maybe at $1,600, maybe at $1,700, and they leave behind a unit renting for $1,300 per month. That's the second link in the moving chain. Jump ahead to the fifth move, and research shows that about half of the people moving into units made vacant by this migration chain earn below their city's median income, and almost a third have incomes in the bottom fifth of the distribution. That's what this chart on the right shows. I want to be clear, this is not theoretical. Researchers tracked the addresses of tens of thousands of individual people to document this effect. When all is said and done, 100 market rate units create vacancies in somewhere around 30 to 50 units of this much lower cost housing, which not only directly benefits people moving into those homes, but also creates slack in the market that gives landlords less leeway to increase rents on everyone else. It rebalances market power between tenants and landlords, and between home buyers and home sellers, and it does so without using any public funds. None of this is to say that market rate buildings are a substitute for subsidies, either for affordable housing development or rent assistance. What it shows, though, is that the two approaches are complementary. Market rate homes stabilize rents and home prices and ensure a continuously improving housing stock. And by stabilizing prices, they also make those subsidies go further, whether you spend a lot or a little. There's a few more things to say about the relationship between market rate and subsidized affordable housing, and I think it's basically captured in this chart. The blue part here shows how the stock of rentals in Montana at different price levels has changed over time. And it shows that between 2010 and 2020, Montana lost about 9,000 rentals that were renting for $600 a month or less. It's not that the units are gone in most cases, they weren't demolished, just that their rents went up. Over the same time period, the state added around 1,300 or 1,400 units funded by the low-income housing tax credit. More subsidies can, and I would argue should, grow that yellow bar, but realistically, you're probably not doubling or tripling the production represented by that bar anytime soon, much less multiplying it the 6 or 7 times you would need to offset the losses of those units in blue. You also need to shrink those losses, and that's where the market can and should contribute. The last thing I'll say here is that I think we need to move past this idea that you can incentivize affordable housing production while at the same time discouraging or not incentivizing or ignoring market rate housing production. I can think of many cities and countries that build a lot of market rate and subsidized below market housing, but virtually none that build very little market rate housing, but a lot of subsidized affordable housing. In the same way, I have never seen a city where building subsidized affordable housing is substantially less expensive than building unsubsidized market rate housing. In the real world, there is really just no such place as a place that is pro-affordable housing, but anti-market rate. It's either pro-housing period or anti-housing period. I personally find analogies helpful, so let's just quickly look at another market, the one for used cars. As I'm sure many of you remember, used cars became much more expensive following the outbreak of COVID-19. Prices shot up by about 50% in 2 years, from an average of around $20,000 in January of 2020 to over $30,000 by 2022. This was not because the used cars all suddenly and miraculously became nicer. They just got more expensive because they suddenly became scarcer. First, new car production declined. Those new cars saw their prices rise as a result. And then the impacts very quickly cascaded down to the used car market. Many people who would have bought a new car in 2020 or 2021 couldn't get one, so their used car didn't end up on the market. And this newly created scarcity drove up prices across the whole market, new and old. Sounding familiar? Bottom line, the price of used cars is linked to the price and availability of new cars, and the price of used housing, we don't ever call it that, but that's what it is linked to the price and availability of new housing. What distinguishes the car market from the housing market, or a key distinction anyway, is that we chose to do this to our housing market, unlike with cars. And we've been enforcing this artificial scarcity for much, much longer. For cars, we underbuilt for 2 or 3 years maybe. For housing, it's been at least 40. Aside from it being the thing that local governments have the most control over, another reason I focus on supply is that building homes is not just a burden that we have to bear. We focus so much on the burdens that come with growth and the costs of growth, and they are real, and they are not always fairly or equally distributed, but growth is also how we got all of the things and the places that we value today. It is an opportunity to build a better future for ourselves and for others. What I hope you will appreciate, if you don't already, is that when the town you live in or the state you live in is in demand, you have options. You can harness that demand and you can turn it into something positive. Your kids want to stay here when they grow up. Others want to move here and put down roots. People believe in your community and they want to invest their time and their money here. And that means new shops and hospitals and infrastructure, new and better services, and new people, new friends and neighbors and employees. That is incredible, and it is a blessing to be celebrated and not a curse to lament. There are thousands of cities and towns across America that would give anything to have the problems that come with desirability and with growth, rather than the opposite. On that note, I've come to think that cities and towns really just have 3 possible futures. Over the medium and long term, cities are either shrinking or they are growing in one of 2 ways. If you're in demand, growth is inevitable, but the form it takes depends on how you respond. One possibility is that you channel that demand into a growing housing stock. The other is channeling it into higher housing prices and rents. Demand will always find an outlet somewhere. You can build and keep housing abundant and affordable, or you can not build, and you can instead force people into a cruel game of musical chairs where those with the fewest resources are left with nowhere to sit, nowhere to live when the music stops. Down that path lies worsening affordability, declining numbers of children and young families and businesses, overcrowding, supercommutes, and homelessness. The third option is for places that people don't really want to be, and those are places that are stagnating or in decline. We heard earlier this morning, I don't think anyone really wants the state to become affordable by wrecking the economy, and I don't think you want to follow Los Angeles down path number 2. So I think it has to be number 1. Here's another way of putting this. You can have a community that is appealing, affordable, and unchanging, but you can only pick 2. If it's appealing and unchanging, it is not going to be affordable. This describes places that draw a lot of people but build very little housing, including big cities like Los Angeles and smaller ones like Boulder, Colorado, or Berkeley, California. If your city or town is unchanging and affordable, that is a pretty sure sign that it is lacking in appeal. This is the story of many Rust Belt cities, for example, over the past several decades. And if it's appealing and affordable, then change is coming, if it hasn't already. People are coming whether you plan for them or not, and that is their right. You can focus on the negatives and let that paralyze you, or you can do the work and turn it to your benefit. As I wrap up here, I just want to quickly discuss a few things that are at the cutting edge of housing research from my perspective and reform, things that I'm personally excited about, and that I think have some lessons for every jurisdiction in America, including those here in Montana. The first is missing middle housing, which is a phrase I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Missing middle, for those who are not, missing middle refers to this wide range of housing types that are denser than detached single-family houses, but smaller than 5 or more story multifamily buildings. That's the middle part. It's missing because we have built very little of it for the past 50 or more years. Development has been really dominated by the two ends of that spectrum, and mostly the single-family end. That is important because missing middle housing has a lot of benefits compared to both larger and smaller buildings. Like detached single-family houses, it can be built with wood, which is the least expensive way to build housing in the US. It also usually doesn't require costly infrastructure like elevators, and parking can be built at the ground level or maybe only partially underground, saving tens of thousands of dollars per space compared to fully above or below ground parking. So it has construction costs like single-family homes, but it also has low per unit land costs like multifamily. In that sense, it's really the best of both worlds, which is why missing middle housing tends to be more affordable than housing at either end of this pole. This also means that it is easier for local developers and contractors to get into the market. This is something we've seen legalizing accessory dwelling units in California. A whole new industry has cropped up. So we're not as reliant on national and international home builders to provide the housing that we need. And because these buildings are no more than 3 or 4 stories, they typically face a tiny bit less resistance than larger projects. But I'm not going to pretend any of this is uncontroversial. Missing middle housing is not a new concept, but as it starts making its way back into zoning codes after many decades of being absent, there's going to be a lot to study and learn from. The second topic is newer, and it is called broad upzoning or mass upzoning. This entails changing zoning to allow more housing on parcels across a city or even across a state all at once. This is in contrast to targeted upzones of one neighborhood, one corridor, or even one parcel at a time, which are much more common practice. When you upzone at that more localized scale, you're doing a few things. One is you're very likely producing a windfall increase in the value of the upzoned parcels themselves, because you've created a relatively small number of locations where there will be intense interest in redevelopment, and the price of that land will be bid up. You're also concentrating redevelopment in just a few neighborhoods at a time, which also concentrates any real or perceived negative impacts from that construction. Part of the appeal of broad upzoning is that if everyone's property now allows more homes, or just many people's properties, then no one's is especially more valuable. It's this idea that if everyone is special, then no one is. Because no one's property is all that special, land prices should not climb nearly as much, and those savings can be passed on to tenants and home buyers instead. And because more diverse housing types can be built in many places, no neighborhood needs to bear a very disproportionate share of the burden that comes with growth. It becomes a shared endeavor where every neighborhood contributes to solving the housing crisis. And just one thing to note on this politically, I don't know that it is all that much harder to pass an upzoning citywide than to do it in a given neighborhood. And when we do it neighborhood by neighborhood, we are committing to having that fight over and over and over again. And I think we just need to move on. This combination of policies of broad upzoning to allow missing middle housing was first, to my knowledge, tested very far away in Auckland, New Zealand, back in 2016. The results there have been very positive with many new housing choices, and inflation-adjusted rents there are the same in 2023 as they were in 2017, while rents across New Zealand are up 15%. US cities have begun adopting a similar approach, I think inspired partly by Auckland, but also out of a recognition that missing middle neighborhoods built 50 or 100 years ago, these streetcar neighborhoods often, are some of the most beloved places that we have even today, and they're something that we should allow to be built again. To my knowledge, the 3 most prominent cities that have done this are Spokane, Washington, Burlington, Vermont, and Sacramento, California. all of which enacted these reforms within the past 6 or 7 months in very different political contexts, and I believe all passed unanimously by their city councils, which is something I am fascinated by and don't understand, but I'm looking forward to learning more. So wrapping up here, I get to travel around and speak at quite a few events like this. I was in Henderson, North Carolina on Thursday and Friday, and Pittsburgh on Tuesday and Wednesday just before that. But this one is a little bit special because Montana has been featured in many of my own presentations from the past year. I share this slide, just gonna show it all there, and I'm not gonna spend any time on it today because you all know this better than I do. I just wanted to share it here though, so you know that the work being done here is being noticed, it's being appreciated, and it is serving as an inspiration to other communities, especially more politically conservative places that don't have many other places to look to. You're showing that housing affordability does not need to be a partisan issue, and that places with very different perspectives are arriving at very similar conclusions about how we're gonna fix it. So thank you for that. The last thing I wanna say is just to reiterate what I've already said. I just wanna encourage you to tackle these housing problems with a clear sense of costs as well as benefits, but also with optimism and positivity. You have a lot to be proud of and a lot to look forward to. You built a wonderful community here that others want to share in and contribute to. I don't believe that your towns and cities and neighborhoods are so fragile that they will be ruined by more people, and you shouldn't believe that either. Take this as a challenge to share your community's opportunities and share your friendship and care with as many people as possible. So thank you again for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the conversation in the breakout. Thanks.
Thank you, Shane. So I know we are running a bit long with our program this morning, but we do want to take a few minutes for Q&A and sort of queue up the breakout session that will be following this session. So I do want to invite up to the front of the room Erin Pahan, who is the Director of Community Planning for the City of Missoula, Community Planning, Development, and Innovation for the City of Missoula. Brock Cherry is the Director of Planning and Community Development for the City of Great Falls. And Keegan Seibenaller is a board member of Shelter WF in the Flathead. So this is going to be our panel in this room at 3 p.m. But we do want to take a couple minutes just to see if there are questions now that anyone would like to raise with Shane, and these other panelists may have context to share as well. So I think we have some mic runners. I see Michael has his hand up, and Chelsea, if you could give Michael the mic. So I know there's a
You need another seat.
Testing.
Oh, there we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Fascinating presentation. Thanks, Shane. A question for you. Just one comment. At the beginning of you're showing that rents have only increased, even adjusted for inflation in Montana between 2012 and 2022, 15%. And I find that to be, our experience is that they've more than doubled. So if you could explain that. And then my fundamental question is thoughts on demographics, the aging of the population. We have a particularly aging population here. And if you see any opportunities in those demographic shifts.
Yeah. The rent number kind of surprised me a little bit too. That comes from the American Community Survey, which is the Census Bureau. They're collecting something, but in any case, I think part of this is also just a lot of this rent increase has been even more recent, and then the data only goes to 2022. We've seen, continued changes, so I think that's probably part of it. But in any case, I believe you that it has been more, and especially in certain communities, part of this is just averaging out across the whole state as well. But to talk about the challenges or opportunities with demographic change, as I think you said, everywhere is getting older, people are living longer, the share of the population that is 65, 75 or older is growing almost everywhere. And that kind of means a few things. One thing is it means, independent of other trends, which are also moving in this direction, but we're getting a lot of one-person households. where frankly, like an older couple, one passes away and someone's living alone. And also just like as people get wealthier, it tends to be the case that more people prefer to live alone, at least for some time in their lives. And so I think it's, we'll sometimes look at a place and say, we built 10% more housing and our population has remained flat. That's the story in parts of Los Angeles. But what we're missing there is the fact that because of shrinking household sizes, because of aging households, even if we had no population growth whatsoever, we need more homes. And we actually need different kinds of homes, especially in a place like Montana where I think it was 3/4 of the homes are single unit homes, probably many of those 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 square feet or more, when 30% or more, I think it's 35% of the households are single people, and many are also just two people. There's kind of an oversupply and an undersupply happening. We have many people who are living in a 4-bedroom house alone or a 5-bedroom house with 2 people, and we need to kind of rematch, but they don't have anywhere to go in many cases. They might like to downsize, but where to without leaving for another community? And so I think there's other things I could say on this, but something I don't think is like gonna make a huge difference, but I think we should do everything we can, is I've heard about in different communities, people, the city, nonprofits, whatever it happens to be, community groups, trying to connect older adults who are maybe living alone, and maybe, have stairs, can't really take care of their house like they're used to, maybe also could use a little extra money, and connecting them with younger people, like in their 20s who are going to college or just out of school, and can help around the house, frankly provide a little companionship in some cases, just as friends. I don't know why I said that. Threw myself off. But I think that's the kind of opportunity, or just connecting with other older people who are in a similar position, but no one's really out there like figuring out that issue. So I think there's lots of things we can do, and building more homes that suit people's needs is one. But again, a lot of it is about how do we use the housing that we have more effectively, more efficiently too.
Great question. So much to discuss here. I think we want to make sure that you do get a break. So is there one more question out in the audience for this group? You will have an opportunity to chat with them more during the breakout. I see some head nodding to Shane's responses. Is there one more question before we break? Oh, great. Chelsea is coming with the mic. Oh, I see. Great.
So the whole zoning discussion is wonderful, but this is Montana, and there is a whole boatload of rural communities out there that have no zoning at all. And wondering if there's any thoughts on how to start that conversation, and if you had the chance to do it over again, what would ideal zoning look like?
The second question, I think the kind of things that places like Spokane and Burlington and Sacramento are doing are pretty close to ideal, where they're allowing this kind of best of both worlds from an affordability perspective, housing everywhere. And I think there's a vision or like a misapprehension that if we allow 3 stories, 60% lot coverage, no density limits, no parking requirement, et cetera, like Spokane does now, that the whole city is going to look like that in 5 years. And I would bet a lot of money that 5% of parcels will not look like that in 10 years. And yet, if it's 3%, that's going to be tens of thousands of homes that have been built, and they're going to be quite affordable homes. So I think that's a really great starting point. I think people, when they hear me talk about zoning, they often hear it as like zoning is all that matters, and it is clearly not. It's part of why I wanted to bring stability and subsidy into here, but just on the supply side, things like building codes, and we eventually get into, okay, we've changed our zoning, you can build more affordable housing and higher density, who's going to build it? We haven't had a large home building sector in many cities for decades,
and it's going to take time to ramp that up. So there's a lot of things to do. I don't really have, I'm going to be very honest, I don't have a great answer for what we do in rural communities, and I really would love to hand it over, because I think you all have so much more experience with that than me.
Yeah, just to add a little bit of color, my day job is working as a civil and environmental engineer in Flathead County, and even outside of formal zoning, there's still quite a lot of restrictions on building in not only zoning, but the other kind of lot usage requirements that still exist in Flathead County and other counties more broadly, as well as regulations like road and bridge requirements that perpetuate, quite big lots and wide roads and things like that. So just eliminating zoning or not having zoning from the starting place is also one small component of some of those restrictions on supply. I also would be interested, Shane, in whether, you cited those cities in particular, but not, for example, a place like Houston that has not had zoning in as formalized of a way. Is that something that you wouldn't point to in the same way? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I know we're trying to have a break, so I'll be quick. Yeah, I mean, the line about Houston is it doesn't have zoning, but through all of its development standards and other things, it almost might as well. Or at least it imposes many of the same restrictions. Like, yes, you can build an office building or a health clinic or whatever in what is mostly a residential neighborhood, but it still is going to have the parking requirements, it's still going to have the height limit, it's still going to have the setbacks, and so it doesn't make much difference in terms of the cost of building there. I think there are things to learn from places like Houston, and frankly, I think maybe the biggest oversight in my book is I don't talk about minimum lot size reform, and that's something that Houston has really shined a light on for me. And minimum lot size reform is especially useful. This is just allowing homes on smaller lots, in Houston it's as small as 1,400 square feet. A real appeal there is you're able to build kind of multifamily density, but these townhome style buildings, they are fee simple ownership, so people can own them without being a part of an HOA. They can get a standard mortgage. It's a way to make home ownership more accessible, and a lot of people, understandably, don't want to rent. They want to buy a home, and this is a way of creating that option as well, not just relying on these larger or even middle-sized multifamily buildings.